Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Rothberg, the 1939 Society Chair in Holocaust Studies, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture with Professor Wolf Gruner on his recent book titled Resistors: How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany. And this lecture is part of the 1939 Society program in Holocaust Studies. And I believe I was told that books would be available after the talk, but I'm not sure if I have seen them. Hopefully that will be true. I want to thank Professor Gruner for being with us today. I'd also like to thank my co-moderator, Jared McBride, Assistant Professor of History and a specialist in the Holocaust in Ukraine, who will join us on stage for the discussion following the lecture. And as always, I'd like to thank the Leve Center staff for the amazing work they do to make all of our events possible. This lecture is generously co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, the Department of History, and the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. So thanks for joining us, and at this point I would ask you to please take a moment to silence your phones. And I'll also just point out that there are some other wonderful events coming up in the next couple of weeks here, and you can find flyers for those just outside. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Wolf Gruner from the University of Southern California. Since 2008, Professor Gruner has been the Chapelle-Guérin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC. And since 2014, he has been the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. A native of Germany, he studied at the Humboldt University of Berlin and then received his PhD in history from the Technical University of Berlin. Besides being a leading scholar of National Socialism and the Holocaust, Professor Gruner plays a variety of critical roles in the field of Holocaust studies. In addition to directing the Dornsife Center, he has been an appointed member of the academic committee at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2017, a member of the International Academic Advisory Board of Yad Vashem since 2012, and a co-founder of the Consortium of Higher Education Centers of Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. A prolific scholar, he's the author of 11 books, including Jewish Forced Labor Under the Nazis, Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2006, and the prize-winning volume, The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, Jewish Responses from 2019. He's edited several more books, including Resisting Persecution, Jews and Their Petitions During the Holocaust, and New Perspectives on Kristallnacht After 80 Years, the Nazi Pogrom in Global Comparison. Besides his important work on National Socialism and the Holocaust, Professor Gruner also has expertise in the comparative history of mass violence on a global scale, as well as racial and state discrimination against indigenous and minority populations, especially in Latin America. And an example of this latter interest is his 2015 book published in Spanish, which I will freely translate, Pariahs of the Fatherland, The Myth of the Liberation of Indigenous Peoples in the Republic of Bolivia, 1825 to 1890. I hope I got that right. The reason we're here today is to hear him discuss his new book, Resistors: How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany, which Yale University Press published in July of this year. In the preface to Resistors, Professor Gruner describes his own intellectual trajectory in working on the Nazi period and the Holocaust. He talks about how his research started with a focus on Nazi institutions and policies, continued with a consideration of the impact of those institutions and policies on Jewish individuals and communities, and only very recently began to take up the question of how individual Jews reacted to and resisted the radically anti-Jewish milieu in which they were living in the 30s and early 40s in Germany. He also talks powerfully there about how his own experience in communist East Germany helped him to understand the kinds of resistance he had begun to observe in the archives. As we will hear, he then began to uncover forms of Jewish agency that have almost always been overlooked in accounts of the Nazi dictatorship. And for me, Gruner's account in Resistors has already had a powerful impact on the way I now think of this historical period. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was giving my annual course lecture on race, law, and everyday life in Nazi Germany in the course on political violence in the modern world that Professor McBride and Professor Gilliland and I all teach, which covers the period from 33 to 39. And while I do very briefly mention a couple of examples of resistance that took place among members of the majority non-Jewish society, I've not tended to put emphasis on Jewish resistance. And yet, when I think today of the materials I had supplied my students, a selection from Victor Klemperer's diary and from Ruth Kluger's memoir, Still Alive, I realize that examples of Jewish resistance have been staring me in the face. For example, the selection from Kluger's memoir that I assigned for this class concerns the time in Nazi-occupied Vienna when, with the encouragement of her mother, the young Ruth Kluger attended a screening of Snow White in a movie theater that was strictly forbidden to Jews. Ruth's humiliating experience being discovered in the theater by the anti-Semitic baker's daughter has led me to talk about this scene as one where a Jewish girl painfully experiences her own racialization for the first time. But I now see that this bitter experience was also an act of defiance and precisely the kind of resistance and example of Jewish agency that Professor Gruner is trying to get us to see as a widespread and mostly forgotten or ignored phenomena. I've always loved this passage in Kluger's great memoir and have even written an essay about it, but after reading Resistors, I find my thinking about the passage significantly transformed. I think that the capacity of the book to fundamentally change our thinking about a topic we thought we knew well is a real testament to the power of this work. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about Resistors. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wolf Gruner.
Thank you so much, Michael, and also Jared, first of all, for the invitation, which kind of brings me full circle when I arrived in Los Angeles, because one of the first lectures I actually attended was here, a 1939 lecture at UCLA. So that's kind of, this was quite a while ago, 15 years. But I also thank you for this really thoughtful introduction, Michael. And somehow you got what I tried to do, is I really tried to change perspective here. And what I want to do in this talk is first I want to share one story, which is kind of one of the chapters in the book. And then I will explain why kind of the perspective changes, what was the reason why we didn't see these types of resistance, and then at the end I will share a brief overview of different types of resistance, individual resistance in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1943. So let me start with the story of a young German Jew in Frankfurt. And I need you to kind of imagine now that you are back in the fall of 1940. So that is after the war started and the invasion of Poland had already begun. It was already, France was already occupied. And the Allied kind of air raids had also started taking place over Germany. So in the fall of 1940, Hans Oppenheimer, a 17-year-old boy, kind of went out every night, breaking the curfew for Jews, which had been established at the beginning of the war. You have to imagine it was pitch black, dark outside because of the Allied air raids. There was no light illuminating the city. So he went out every night and waited anxiously till the kind of Allied bombers circled in. And when they started to drop their bombs, he set off a wrong fire alarm. And the reason was to divert the fire trucks, the firefighters, from the actual burning houses. So he did this several times. And the question is, how did he actually get there? So when we think about Hans Oppenheimer, I just want to mention he was the firstborn son of a merchant family in Frankfurt. His father was kind of selling linens and other accessories to tailors in Frankfurt. They lived a good life before 1933. They had a good apartment in one of the most imposing boulevards in Frankfurt. And in 1933, Hans Oppenheimer graduated from elementary school. And because of the starting persecution under Hitler, the parents enrolled him not in a public school, but in one of the most famous Jewish private schools in Germany, the Philanthropic. And at the time, for the next years, the Philanthropic was able to kind of shield the Jewish students from this kind of increasingly hostile environment. After Hans graduated from middle school in 1937, he didn't go to high school, or he decided not to go to high school. He decided to do an apprenticeship, and he did this for two reasons. One was, the short-term reason was he wanted to kind of acquire skills to get a manual job to sustain his family, because his father had already lost his business. The family was depending on welfare. The second reason was he was really thinking kind of long-term to escape Germany because of the persecution. And to learn kind of a craft would help him to easier immigrate to other countries. And he made this decision because of the increasing persecution in Frankfurt and in Nazi Germany in general, but particularly in Frankfurt, because while the persecution played out differently in German cities, depending on the role of Nazi mayors and also different kind of departments, Frankfurt was, with the second largest Jewish population in Germany, one of the most hostile places very early on. The mayor was a kind of a fierce Nazi, and he introduced immediately, when he took power in 1933, kind of the first anti-Jewish measures. He cut business contracts with Jewish merchants who had contracts with the municipality. The city employees who were Jewish were expelled. And then later on, Frankfurt was one of the initiators of organization of art collections, private Jewish foundations, and also real estate. So under these kind of circumstances, he decided to take on a kind of apprenticeship, and he did this in a Jewish vocational school, which was a private school, which was also kind of a result of the persecution. It was founded in 1936, so a year before he started there, and it was supposed to train Jewish teenagers in different crafts like locksmiths, carpentry, and so on, to prepare them for future immigration to Palestine, to the United States, or other countries, for example, in Latin America. After he finished the apprenticeship, he registered at the labor office because, as I said, he wanted to have a kind of a job immediately to earn money to help his family. However, when he did this, it was the spring of 1939. So after the November program happened, Kristallnacht, and he was recruited for an early forced labor program, which is not so well known. At the time, the Ministry of Labor had started an anti-Jewish forced labor program, which first targeted unemployed Jews who were registered at the labor office. So exactly people like Hans Oppenheimer, although he was on the younger side because he had never worked before. So he was sent to one of the first labor camps for Jews. He was in the labor camp for 1 year. Then he was sent back to Frankfurt. He worked as a forced laborer for the municipality. And then the labor office sent him to another labor camp. At the time when he was in the labor camp, this program already encompassed more than 20,000 Jewish men in Nazi Germany proper. They toiled on road constructions. They were kind of employed for garbage removal, usually heavy manual kind of jobs in Germany proper, but also in Austria. When he was in this labor camp, which was kind of like 15 miles away from Frankfurt, he was not allowed to come back to visit his family. because anti-Jewish labor regulations kind of erased kind of vacations for Jewish forced laborer. And then the circumstances in this labor camp were horrific. The mayor of the town who established the camp was heavily anti-Semitic. He segregated the Jewish men from the town population. They were, he ordered several times extra beatings to kind of enhance their productivity. The kind of circumstances were so bad that one of the Jewish laborers committed suicide in this camp. And this is like 1939, 1940. So when he was released from this labor camp and sent back to Frankfurt, this is the moment when he decided to do something. And this takes us back to the beginning of the talk, that he started to go out and set off wrong fire alarms every night when it was possible, when there were kind of Allied air raids. Unfortunately, he only used 3 kind of locations close to his home. Because of the curfew, there were policemen patrolling, so he was scared to be caught. And because of these 3 locations, the Gestapo could kind of, in a way, circle in, and they set a trap. And on December, the 10th of December 1940, around 10 p.m., during one of the air raids, he was caught red-handed in front of a fire alarm post. He was 4 months in detention, waiting for a trial. And in this time, the main prosecutor in Frankfurt tried to kind of figure out how to kind of punish Hans Oppenheimer for these wrong fire alarms. First, they thought they might charge him with treason, which would have kind of yielded the death penalty, but they could not really fit this into their legal framework. So in the end, they charged him with felonies under the criminal code and for offenses under the war decree against so-called public vermin, Volksschädlinge, during the war. The written indictment emphasized that Hans Oppenheimer was a full Jew, and the prosecutor kind of emphasized that according to the Gestapo assessment of Hans Oppenheimer, he was a lazy Jew, he was unstable, and he was also a dishonest human being. And they assessed that he was eager to destroy property. Under the interrogation by the Gestapo, Hans Oppenheimer only admitted to 9 cases of wrong fire alarms. But the indictment actually mentions that they suspect that he was actually responsible for 44 fire alarms, because this series started when he came from the labor camp and ended when he was arrested. But they couldn't prove it, because he didn't admit to it. So when he was then put on trial in May 1941, he was finally charged with 9 cases, as I said. And interestingly, during the trial, there was no defense lawyer present, so he had to defend himself as an 18-year-old Jewish teenager. And as we could assume, he was, in the end, punished or sentenced with 3 years in prison under the Public Vermin Act during the war, because he supposedly sabotaged the war effort. The punishment was not as harsh as the prosecutor kind of wanted to. They asked for 6 years, and they also wanted to have him tried as an adult, which the judge actually denied. And so he was a little bit more sympathetic to him, but nevertheless he would emphasize in the verdict that Hans had to pay special attention to the German law, because he was acting only as a guest in Germany, and so that's why he was punished also more harshly than they could. Then he was transferred to a prison, and from the very first day on, he was put in solitary confinement, and he had to work kind of folding envelopes, as many prisoners in prison have to do. his only lifeline was kind of writing letters, monthly letters to his family, to his parents. But the confinement, the isolation, took a kind of a mental toll on him. And also his body was kind of weakened because previously he had kind of performed heavy manual labor, not with the best nutrition. And so he had several kind of health issues in jail, which were not attended to. So he tried to kind of get his parents to visit him, to bring him medicine for these things. And what he didn't know is that the prison warden confiscated most of these letters because they were too outspoken about the kind of terrible conditions in jail for Hans Oppenheimer. His health quickly deteriorated and exhausted him physically and emotionally, so bad that he attempted to take his own life twice. And I don't know if, fortunately or unfortunately, the prison guards kind of saved him twice from saved his life twice, and he was still kind of in a very depressed mood. And in one of the letters, which was confiscated, he talked to his parents about his life and how kind of desperate he is. And he said, "You have to imagine, when I think about my short life until now, I can go crazy because you know better than everybody else. I could I never could visit a cinema. I could never visit a theater or a cabaret." So after spending 2 years in prison, there was an agreement between the Justice Ministry and the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, to transfer all prisoners, Jewish prisoners, to concentration camps, which meant at the time, at the end of 1942, to transfer them to Auschwitz. And he ended up in Auschwitz, and because of his weakened physical state, he only survived for like 2 or 3 weeks in Auschwitz and perished a few days after he turned 20 years old. So, what does this story of Hans Oppenheimer reveal about the individual responses of Jews toward the Nazi persecution? So during the Third Reich, the Nazis complained often in their official reports about the so-called impudent Jews. And for example, in March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen reported, quote, "The number of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person has become quite numerous and in their tone often impudent," end of quote. Still during the war, the Reich Main Security Office of the SS reported that it had received information from various corners of the Reich about the impudent attitude of Jews during the war. Usually, historians like myself, we thought the mentioning of the impudent Jews was just a pretext to introduce new harsh measures against the Jews. But I think they actually kind of have a relationship to what Jews actually did. And to give you one example, in July 1935, there were riots in Berlin, anti-Jewish riots and demonstrations against Jews in Berlin. And in the same month, the Gestapo wrote a report and said that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. And one had to know that at the same months, there were actually more than 100 arrests of Jews in Berlin for offenses against the state, the Nazi party, and the policies against the Jews. So there is a direct correlation between the disrespect of the state and people acting on the street. So it was not just Nazi rhetoric, what we see here in these reports. And this goes on till the war starts, even during the war. So for example, in 1942, right when the mass deportations already were in full swing, 1,200 Jews were in jail, like Hans Oppenheimer, for offenses against the Nazi state and the Nazi party. And this is, to put this in perspective, a number which seems small, but in perspective, kind of in relation to the remaining Jews, it would be like when we take the population of the United States, it would be almost 7 million people in jail for resistance. That's kind of the relation. So the frequent complaints about impudent Jews point to a forgotten reality of widespread acts of resistance. And during the last decade, so I'm working on this for 12 years, my research revealed that hundreds and hundreds of Jews, men and women, young and old, performed kind of different acts of resistance. And this rediscovery of these acts which were ignored demands a reassessment what we think about Jewish reactions towards the Nazi persecution. And I think it strongly challenges our idea that most of the Jews were passive or kind of fatalistic towards the persecution of the Jews. It's not that historians never thought about Jewish resistance, and you all know this, but the difference is that most discussions about Jewish resistance focused on kind of organized resistance, group resistance, and armed resistance. And this starts right in 1945. The first books about Jewish resistance focus on partisans, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and so on. There is a different strand, mostly in Israel, where Israeli scholars from the very beginning pointed that there is more than just these armed acts of resistance. They talk about spiritual resistance, about cultural resistance, and so on. But in the wider community, internationally, this was not really picked up. And most people thought about Jewish resistance, or still think about Jewish resistance, as kind of organized and armed. And what I try to do in my work here is to revive some of these Israeli ideas, but then also other kind of scholars like Konrad Kuit in Australia, there was Helmut Eschwege in East Germany. They all tried to kind of emphasize that also we need to think about individual resistance as part of the Jewish resistance. And so it's not highly original what I'm doing. I'm just reviving already existing ideas and kind of tease them out and really follow through with them. And what I did is to kind of guide my research that I kind of changed a very well-known definition of resistance, which is commonly used. It is from Yehuda Bauer, one of the most prominent Holocaust scholars. And the only thing what I do is I add this word individual. And I think this changes everything, because it now allows kind of nonconformism, disobedience of laws, to include in our assessment what resistance is. And I want to illustrate this with some images. So this image is 1933, Munich, stormtroopers drag Michael Siegel, who was a lawyer, through the city of Munich. We usually take this picture as an act of random terror against Jews. But look at the poster. It says, "I won't complain at the police station anymore." So this was not a random act of terror. It was a deliberate kind of targeted act because somebody kind of acted in defiance. So the same is true for this picture. I use this in my class to highlight the initiatives of local governments and city governments, for example, to restrict access to public facilities. But then when I started to think about resistance, look at her body kind of language. Yeah, this is taken not to just say, oh, the Nazis are kind of persecuting me. No, it says actually something very different. It says, you can't do this with me, right? And very similar is this picture where you have the Jewish family in front of their house, where one of the most notorious anti-Jewish slogans is kind of painted on, smeared on. And my favorite picture, which is the cover of the book, is Lizzie Rosenfeld. And for those who don't read German, it is she's sitting on a bench which is prohibited for Jews. And look also at her body language, how she embraces this and how she is kind of smiling in the camera. And she does practically 3 crimes at the same time. She sits on the bench, she lets her friend take a picture, and then later she smuggles this negative out of Austria and Germany, and that's how it ended up in the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. And when you look at more pictures, taking pictures is itself an act of defiance. So, for example, this leads to my next book project. This is a picture from a Kristallnacht. Hans Sachs documents the home invasion and the destruction of his private home, which I'm researching for my next book, so the violence and destruction of Jewish homes during Kristallnacht. So the book, what I'm trying to do there is having this broader perspective, and to add on this, I'm also using a very different source base than we previously have used for thinking about Jewish attitudes, Jewish behavior. Mostly what we used were either these Nazi reports or ego documents like diaries or memoirs. However, in all of these sources, this type of individual resistance I'm kind of investigating was not really kind of showing up. The Nazis didn't want to highlight Jewish resistance, first of all, and Jews in their ego documents, they had also this understanding of resistance is only when you are armed and when you are doing something with violence. So what I used is kind of interesting. Most of my sources are perpetrator sources, police records, court records, but then I added also the investigation of 170 interviews from the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. And in all of those, I can paint a very different picture of individual Jewish resistance. And what I want to do is, or what I needed to do is, because I found when I started to dig, and I went to archives in Munich, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Hamburg, Vienna, Berlin, I found so many instances of different, a great variety of different acts of defiance that I had to kind of a problem how to sort them out. So what I came up with is this kind of type to categorize them under certain rubrics. And most of the cases I found we can subsume under these different rubrics. So one is challenging anti-Jewish propaganda and Nazi propaganda. The second one is speaking up in public. The third one is different forms of protest and writing. And then disobedience of Nazi legislation. And the last one is physical self-defense. And what I want to do is to share a few stories with you for each category of this, what I came up with. So contesting Nazi propaganda is an interesting, is one of the kind of types of resistance here, which is not so widely documented. And it has a little bit to do that these were often acts which kind of happened in a second, and so people were much harder to detect. And so what I'm thinking about here are acts of, for example, ripping down a Nazi poster, destroying a Nazi flag, or, for example, here, in this case, the story of David Bornstein. He was a 35-year-old man in Hamburg. He was a merchant. He had a small shop. And one summer day in 1936, he accompanied his wife to the bus terminal at the outskirts of the city. His wife wanted to visit her parents, so they were standing. She was already sitting in the bus, and he was standing outside talking through the window to her. And what did he do? While speaking, he shielded with his body the Nazi logo on the bus and tried to destroy the kind of Nazi, the swastika. And you see here the blow-up of the Gestapo photo, and I hope you can see these scratches. Yeah. So he was denounced by a bus conductor who was standing by waiting for his own departure. And later the Gestapo did a historical reenactment here. So you see here, this is not David Bornstein. This is a Gestapo officer impersonating David Bornstein. And up there, that's not his wife. This is the bus conductor. And hold on, who denunciated him. Yeah, so we have actually a photo of the denunciator here, which is very rare. So he was denunciated and put on trial, and he was punished after a short trial with 5 weeks in prison for the small act of destruction here. Later on, and this is maybe a side note, many of those men who were caught for either speaking up in public, who ended up in jail, were later in 1938 all arrested and put in concentration camps during a raid in June 1938. This was before Kristallnacht, where the raid was against so-called asocials. But every Jew with a criminal record was perceived as asocial and was also put in concentration camp. So he was several months in a concentration camp because of the swastika incident. When he was released and he survived, some of the other inmates didn't survive. He immediately left Germany with his wife and his small daughter and escaped to Palestine. And later on, even during the war, there are arrest notes about this kind of ripping down Nazi flags, besmearing kind of displays of anti-Semitic newspapers and so on. So the next type is oral protest. Very much in the beginning, one could assume that there would be kind of critique of the first wave of terror of the Nazis. And for example, in Frankfurt, there were dozens of trials against Jews who spoke up against kind of these wild concentration camps, the torture of Jews, and also some first murders. But throughout the years, we find many cases where women and men spoke up in public, in restaurants, on the street, in their neighborhood, criticizing either anti-Jewish laws, Hitler, or other anti-Jewish policies. And to share one case with you, which is also a chapter in the book, Henriette Schäfer, she lived in a mixed marriage, and the day after Kristallnacht, she went out under the impression of what happened during this night, went into a store and approached the shop owner and said, "What are you thinking about what happened last night, that they arsoned the synagogues and everything?" And then the store owner says, along the Nazi propaganda kind of line, "Oh, this is the outrage of the German people because of the assassination of this German diplomat in Paris." And then she said, and let me quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. So she received 6 months for this comment in prison. And she received this under this law, which we previously thought would kind of was enacted mainly against communists and social democrats. But you can find in almost every archive in Germany court proceedings and verdicts under this law that they used it to quell Jewish kind of protest. And this didn't end like with Kristallnacht, as I said. You find still cases during the war. And for example, in February 1942, the special court in Vienna sentenced Gabriele Reich to 10 months in prison because she insulted Hitler publicly. She criticized anti-Jewish legislation, and she also listened to forbidden foreign broadcasts. And this is, by the way, also interesting that we often find cases where Jewish men and women often commit various offenses against different variety of legislations at the same time. So, oh, I didn't show you actually Gabriele Reich. So that's Gabriele Reich and the Gestapo mugshot 1941 in Vienna. So the next part is written protest. And here we have a variety of different forms of written protest. One is, from the beginning, Jews used petitions to kind of protest against Nazi legislation. And we often disregarded these petitions because we thought, oh, they were written in vain. The Nazis never cared, right? this is not really true, as recent research shows, because Nazis were occupied with these petitions. But I think more important is actually that in these petitions, Jews reclaimed their identity as Germans, as contributors to the fatherland, and as contributors also to cultural life in Germany or in Austria. You have petitions over the whole time span, and I mentioned earlier the riots in Berlin in 1935. So you have tons of petitions of store owners where the windows were defaced, but you have also, interestingly, anonymous leaflets at the time. And one of the leaflets is here kind of recorded in a police record. And this was a small kind of business card type of flyer, which was anonymous and was distributed in mailboxes of businesses in the center of Berlin. And it said, I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler," end of quote. Even during the war, many Jews complained in writing, again with petitions, but also in this kind of anonymous way. And one of the remarkable stories, which is also one chapter of the book, is the story of a former real estate broker who was almost 70 years old in 1941, Benno Neuburger, who lived in Munich. And he kind of experienced the takeover by Hitler, the persecution of the Jews in Munich. His children emigrated early on to the United States. He could not, he and his wife, they could not witness the marriage of their children in the US. They could not witness the birth of their grandchildren. They had only kind of paper exchanges via letters. So when the Yellow Star was introduced, Benno Neuburger could not bear it anymore. So all what he'd experienced with the practical loss of his children and the increasing persecution, he decided to do something. What he did was, and that's why this post-stamp is here, he used postcards, put the Hitler stamps, the five Pfennig mark stamps on them, and then he wrote abusive comments on these post stamps. And I share two with you. The very first one he wrote on them was the very first postcard: "The eternal mass murderer Hitler, disgusting!" exclamation mark. And one of the later ones was very foresighted, almost prophetic. He said, "Hitler, murderer of 5 million." The Gestapo caught him because he made a mistake. He used one of his former real estate postcards. He was put in prison. He was tortured. You can see this here on the mugshot, that on the left hand of his face, you can see the bruises from the torture. Nevertheless, he stood by what he did. This was perceived as an act of treason. He was transferred from Munich to Berlin, where he was tried at the notorious anti-Semitic People's Court in Berlin. And even there, under the most heaviest of kind of risk, kind of receiving the death penalty for treason, he said that he hated Hitler because of the kind of persecution of the Jews, the announcement to exterminate the Jews, and the introduction of the Yellow Star. He was punished with the death penalty, and he was beheaded in September 1942. So, just briefly, defying and disobeying anti-Jewish legislations was very widespread. All anti-Jewish laws were in some way boycotted or ignored by a variety of young and elderly Jews. Just to share two things with you. One is, you all have heard probably about that Jews had to adopt the discriminatory middle names Sarah and Israel, right? We never thought that actually Jews had to apply for the name change. This was not something given that the Nazis just could order. It was actually a legal process. You had to apply for it. They had to pay 3 Reichsmark. And guess what? Many of them didn't. They never filled out these forms. So we have records that elderly Jewish woman, like 73-year-old Ida Schneider in Leipzig, she was caught 2 years later. That she never took on this discriminatory middle name, that she didn't carry identification papers marked with Jews, and she was not the only one. You can find similar stories from other in the same city, but also in other cities. And one story, just to show you how broad this is the story of Max Mannheimer. He was a forced laborer, and when he was a forced laborer, he's committed several offenses against various anti-Jewish restrictions. And he is one of the very few actually writing about this in his diary. And I want to quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind a tool shed. From there I go to the public park, despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite the ban to visit the park. On my way I count the signs with the slogan 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total there are 6. Later at 11 p.m. I rip the signs out of the ground, throw some in the bushes and some into the creek. However, all my courage was futile, because the next evening all the signs had re-emerged. For a second time, I did not have the courage. I'm just not a hero." So when you think about it, he went even back the next day to check if they were still gone. So I think I would probably you all agree with me to disagree with him, right, about his characterizations. He was very courageous. So coming to my last category, which is physical self-defense. And this is an interesting part of the research, because most of these stories are not kind of in the archives in Germany, because physical altercations were not really recorded in the archives unless they had a political kind of context. So most of what I know is actually from testimonies from the Shoah Foundation, where survivors mention, for example, that relatives were beating up stormtroopers because they were harassed, or they beat up Nazi neighbors because they discriminated against Jews in their apartment buildings. And I want to share one really remarkable story with you, which is from Daisy Gronowski. She was a 16-year-old girl who was from Berlin, but lived during 1938 in a retraining camp, a Hachshara camp in West Germany. Hachshara camps where young Jews were prepared for immigration with agricultural training, so that they had better immigration chances. So she was in one of these retraining camps, and all of them were raided during Kristallnacht. All of them. As was hers. So the stormtroopers came into the camp, destroyed the furniture, and started to beat up the teachers and the teenagers. And this is what she is now talking about here, and I hope this works.
You know, the youngsters. And the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden, I came my turn. I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5'0" I'm 5'1". 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden, it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back. And that was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now here, big, tough guys. You want to hit a little girl. What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back. It hurt. And I got to the end of the line. One of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I'd learned a little trick. And that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him. And I started fighting. And I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand. I used the knife. I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy, beaten up on the film. So a couple of the guys saw it, and they dragged him underneath a bed, or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off. We ran, all of us. And they started covering after, then give up on it.
So, as you notice, she was able to escape. However, she was caught 2 days later again. She escaped again, and then was caught again, and escaped again. This is what I call kind of a resistance career. And just to kind of explain how she managed to kind of overwhelm the stormtrooper, she had some jiu-jitsu self-defense training with Hashomer Hatzair back in Berlin when she was like between 12 and 14 years old. So, but what I want to say is she's one of these persons who kind of not only commit offenses or resist once, but in a kind of several times. And you have many of those in my cases. So let me come to the conclusion. So what I think is when we define resistance by including individual acts, our perspective really changes, as you could see. But I have to say, although my research kind of brought to light really hundreds and hundreds of cases, this is still not the full amount, because I was a one-man show. I could only visit certain archives. And so many archives are still untouched. Other cases never left traces in archives, because people perished. We don't have records of people who survived because they never talked about this. So there is, even beyond what I researched, there is so much more to explore. But what I try to show is that we can subsume these different types of resistance under these 5 categories, which I shared with you. And what I want to really emphasize is, usually we thought about resistance in a way that young people are much more prone to resistance than elderly people. What I can say is, and by the way, men more than women. What my research shows, that is all not true. Women were equally resistant as men. Young or elderly people were also resistant in large kind of amounts. I also could not find kind of specific traits or something which we previously assumed would kind of enable people to resist. We have everything, every social background, every education, every kind of upbringing represented in my pool of cases. So there is no pattern. Nobody is more kind of able to resist than others. That was a very, I think, important result of my research. And what I can say is that the types of resistance change over time. First, it is more against Nazi propaganda and economic measures. Later, more against segregation, forced labor, and in the end, more against for example, deportation. But interesting is, it is really a huge variety of different acts of resistance. And already in the 1960s, a Berlin rabbi wrote about this in a very striking quote. I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 of different manners." End of quote. Some of you might be skeptical of these kind of, what I shared with you are really resistance, like sitting on a park bench. But I think it is not upon us to define what resistance is, actually. It's not about the survivors that they can declare, I resisted. In the end, it was the perpetrator who really kind of showed what they perceived as resistance, what they perceived as threat, that's what they punished. And the slightest kind of aggression, like the beginning of my talk, scratching a swastika, was perceived as an act of resistance. And I want to highlight that this is not just, let's say, true for Nazi Germany. Just today I found actually a case online that in Moscow somebody for besmearing a poster of Russian war heroes in Ukraine was kind of punished with 6 years in prison. Yeah? So dictatorships kind of punish the smallest deeds with kind of harsh measures. So I think we need to reassess what Jewish resistance is, and I think what I can share in the book and here is that our old idea of that Jews were passive is kind of obsolete once and for all after this research. Thank you.
Which, you know, now in listening to the lecture, for me, is not only giving us a really new vision of how Jews negotiated with their situation in Nazi Germany, but really also gives us a new view of what, for me at least, a new view of what everyday life was like, or starts to give us a new view of what everyday life was like. There's so many fascinating details about how things played out, which are so unexpected in so many ways, I think. That's the impression I have. So we are now joined by Jared McBride from the History Department. And I don't know if Jared will ask a couple of questions maybe to get us started and then open things up, of course, to the audience. So do you want to?
Sure, yeah. I mean, first I want to congratulate Wolf on a wonderful book. You referred to yourself as a one-man show just a few minutes ago. It's a very impressive one-man show with quite a lot of accomplishments so far, and we're just so happy to have you here and to hear about your work. And I think this is somewhat to Michael's point already, like all good or great history books, you invite the reader to rethink things that they already thought that they knew, and bring them along the way through the process of rethinking something. So maybe I'll just open it and steal the floor here just for a second and start with a question or two to get us going, and then I'm sure there's going to be many questions from the audience so we can have a really great discussion. So this is, I guess, kind of an archives question which has already come up in the discussion or in your presentation so far. So some of your readers may be aware of a certain irony, and I don't think it's actually an irony, but an irony that here we have a scholar who is housed at one of the largest oral history testimony archives on planet Earth, has approached this really innovative project through perpetrator documents, which you've already made reference to. And you've talked about using perpetrator documents to get at the voice of victims. And this is certainly a sensitive topic. It has historically been a sensitive topic in discussing Nazi history. And I think it's sensitive because, in a sense, and you've alluded to this, I think, in your presentation already, it's sensitive because, in a way, you have to somewhat take the Nazis at their word, right? That these people actually did the things that they're being accused of in the files that you're reading. And so, kind of on the same theme of perpetrator documents, one of the big things that we always talk about is the ability to corroborate them with other information. So maybe just hearing a little bit more about what that process looked like with this book, how that did in fact fit in maybe with some of the testimonies from that are located at your place of work every day. And then also just kind of more maybe kind of conceptually, I mean, previous historians or readers of these court cases or a lot of the material you're using, what were they thinking when they actually looked at these sources prior to you? I mean, what was their, what were the kind of roadblocks that were preventing them from kind of coming to the same kind of conclusions you have? And here, and I'm not positing this, but I'm just curious, is there something here about the kind of the vestiges of totalitarian theory, this idea that we can't actually believe we can't believe what these states had to say about their societies, or that these totalitarian states are always lying about themselves, so we really can't take them at their word. That would be my first set of questions on archives. And then just a second set here, and this is, I think, somewhat to Michael's comments to begin, it's kind of shifting our gaze to the 33 to 39 period in your book, which brings out or sees resistance where before we had mostly just seen repression. So this kind of resistance that's hiding behind repression. And I was also thinking about Michael's lecture from 2 weeks ago, and when I was reading this introduction, that why did Michael mention all this resistance? But no, I didn't actually.
Now I will.
Yeah, now we will. Now we know. We're gonna be up to date here. But I'm actually I mean, this is not maybe put the onus on other historians, other thinkers. I mean, what really was in the way here of kind of coming to these conclusions that you've been able to show so clearly in your book? I mean, you've mentioned obviously other scholars have talked about it. I mean, what were the major conceptual roadblocks for really seeing this thing that seems to be, as you've shown us today, I think very clearly, hiding in plain sight? And here, just again, positing an idea, I'm curious to hear what you think. I mean, was there something here about this idea that, you know, in the way we kind of tell the story of German Jews were in fact great German citizens, they participated in society, they were patriotic, so to assume that they had done illegal things or had done things that were actually wrong that resulted in repression, that kind of plays with that in maybe an uncomfortable way. And I'm just, you know, just that's an open thought. So I will leave it there and stop.
Push the button there. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, this would be 2 other lectures, actually. So I would say, why haven't other historians seen this? I think, first of all, as I mentioned briefly, a lot of my cases are court records, and especially, which I didn't go into, they come from special courts, which were supposed to try under this kind of treacherous tax law. And there is a book about the treacherous tax law, which uses a bunch of archives in West Germany, and it doesn't mention Jewish defendants. It only mentions communists and social democrats, because they were the main target. So I think for the person who wrote this dissertation, he might have seen some of these cases I saw, but he was kind of neglecting them as kind of outliers. And I think what for me was the striking thing, when I started this, I also thought an outlier, because I started this research by coincidence when I was in an archive and I went through police logbooks of Berlin police precincts, and I thought I will find stuff about the persecution, and suddenly there was this half a page about a policeman writes political offense, and then he describes that a Jewish man protested in public. And it resonated with me, on the one hand, because of my personal experience in dictatorships, that these are small things which can have really grave consequences. But then I also thought, but this might be a very rare case, because I never came across such a thing. But this kind of sparked my interest, and maybe because of my personal history, I wanted to really pursue this. Other people probably had kind of just taken it as an outlier. So that's how I started and tried to track down more of these cases. First in the police logbooks, I found many more. Then I tried to find these people in court cases, which I didn't, but I found many more other court cases. And then I branched out from the special courts to regular courts, where I found all these other cases which were not public protests, but for example, the story of Hans Oppenheimer and so on. So I think a special kind of perspective, because my views changed, but also that certain expectations are kind of defied, because I also thought at the time when I found this first incident, I had already done 20 years of research on the persecution of the Jews in Germany. And I thought I knew everything. And especially Berlin, because I'm kind of from Berlin. A lot of the research I have done was on Berlin. So when I looked at this police logbook in Berlin, I thought, no, this can't be, this is really strange. And so I also had to re-establish myself there. And because my idea was similar to what you mentioned, the Jews were persecuted and they gradually adapt. And this is also not so wrong, because many Jews after the war actually thought the same. So I found this in the Berlin Jewish newspaper. There was a kind of article, I think it was because of the anniversary of the Yellow Star, where some Jewish journalists then said, practically, I can't quote this now, but practically, to paraphrase this, every measure against the Jews kind of burned down a little bit of our resistance, and so we gradually kind of retrieved, so to speak. So this was in 1946, yeah, that somebody said this. So quite contrary to all my evidence what I have. So it may be a very individual perspective, but it was there. And remind me of the other question.
The archive ones, working with the perpetrator documents.
Oh, so yeah, so perpetrator documents. So I had this long trajectory, what was already mentioned, from institutions to Jewish reactions, and I worked from the very beginning a lot with administrative documents, but also I conducted interviews. So I always looked at both sides. But when I found this first trace of in the police logbook, I also thought, yeah, why didn't I come across this in kind of diaries or memoirs? And really, I think the problem is our old perception, what resistance is. And when survivors, when they write down, first of all, much of the previous time in Germany was overwhelmed by what happened later. So there's much more in detail what happened in Auschwitz than what happened in the pre-period time. So there's much more attention to this. But even then, we know that even in Auschwitz people resisted. Yeah. So this is not there is a continuity there too. So I think when I then looked at these perpetrator records, I tried to read them against the grain. And I was fully aware of your question, is this embellishment because they want to punish them? But interestingly, what we forget is the Nazis perceived themselves still as a legal system. So sometimes what we think, or what one can hear, when somebody did something in Nazi Germany, they would be thrown right into a concentration camp. This was not actually like this. The Gestapo could imprison people in concentration camp, but the majority of the people were tried under law when they broke laws. Do you want to chime in?
Well, that was one of the things that really kind of amazed me about some of these stories. The fact that in May 1941, a young Jewish man is on trial for setting off fire alarms and is then sentenced to 3 years in prison, and that there are 1,200 Jews in prison, as you mentioned at one point. I think our expectation is, naively, ignorantly perhaps, that they would just, why don't you just send them directly to the concentration camp? So on the one hand, of course, like the penalties are harsh for the smallness of the crimes, but they're actually mild in comparison to our kind of stereotypes of what you'd expect from a Nazi and a Jew, especially when you're talking 1941 or so. It's so late, and yet.
Yeah, I mean, the picture is a little bit more complex because some of the prison sentence which end like in 1941, then those inmates were handed over to the Gestapo. Some women ended up in Ravensbrück for small kind of public protest. Vienna, the Gestapo didn't really heed so much to legal frameworks, so sometimes they put Jews directly into deportation transports in 1942. But in general, the majority of the cases, they were tried under law. And interesting is, while we have a lot of prosecutors who are very anti-Semitic, the judges are acting very differently, and in two ways. One, they are trying to really pay attention to law. They wanted to see witnesses of crimes. They even challenged witnesses when they thought they were not reliable. And interestingly, even during the war, Jews got acquitted from trials because witnesses were not deemed reliable, or they kind of used defenses that they had a mentally ill kind of a history of mentally illness, which would help under German law. You could actually be acquitted under this. So this depended very much on the situation. And to illustrate this, there was a judge in Hamburg who tried somebody for public protest. He got several months in prison for this. Several months later, he tried a Jewish woman who went into a police station in Hamburg and yelled at the policeman, "Down with Hitler." That's during the war, 1941. And she got only 2 weeks in prison for this because the judge said in the verdict that she acted out of despair, which was true. But that he actually used this as a kind of a, what is it called, better circumstances for the verdict, for the punishment. And then several months later, somebody else spoke up, a Jew, and he got again half a year in prison. So it depended on the person, on the individual circumstances. Even the same judge would act differently. So I think this is really, situations are much more complex, and we need to kind of go back to the complexity to understand the reality and go away from kind of sometimes our very simplistic pictures.
So interesting to say. I was thinking just now as you were talking also about an example and possibly another category that I wonder if you considered, which is something about like intra-Jewish solidarity. Is that also a form, preserving a sense of community? Is that also potentially something that we might think of as resistance? And I was thinking of, again, in a kind of very individual case from Kluger, around the same, in the memoir, around the same place where she talks about this scene in the cinema, which I think is fascinating, where it's right after the star is required, and they're walking in the street, and a Jewish woman is coming toward them, and says to Kluger's mother, like, "Oh, it looks good on you. It matches your clothes well," or something like that. It's a very small and kind of minor thing, but also clearly in some ways a kind of act of resistance against the star, right? Or an appropriation of that and claim to some sort of communal solidarity. So I don't know if that fits in your schema, but I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, no, I thought about this, but I deliberately excluded these kind of things because I want to really highlight the individual. And I'm fully aware, and I say this in the conclusion of the book, that nobody exists in a vacuum. And everybody has relationships, friends, family, and the Jewish community or neighborhood. And this plays a big role, I think, to understand the context of individual decisions. So I think, but I left this open for, let's say, the next one to discover this, because I didn't want to go, when I want to highlight individual acts, then to talk about relationships, which then creates imagined groups. I would have kind of gotten myself into murky waters again. And so I say this is the next step in the research where we need to understand how did relationships confirm, for example, certain acts of resistance, or kind of help to motivate people to do this, or discourage people also, because people took enormous risks. And many of these stories I found, people were conscious about what they got themselves into, that the risk they took for themselves or also for families and friends. So I think these relationships are the next step to really understand more about kind of what kind of motivates somebody, or helps to motivate somebody, or discourages somebody.
Thanks. Yeah, let's take some questions from the cabinet.
Just a question. What are numbers? I mean, what kind of numbers are we talking about? So, for instance, like in Berlin, what were the numbers of police, of resistance, of individual resistance? You said you saw so much and so many, but were you able to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of amount?
I wish. No, but I can say what I try to do with this example of the 1200, which would kind of relate to 7 million people in jail in the US, that's kind of where you see the relationship. Not everybody does this, but many, right? Yeah. Or in Berlin, I have numbers. July, I mentioned over 100 people were arrested. Mm-hmm. The next month, over 60. The next month, over 50. The next month, over 60. The next month, over 70. The next month, over 50. So I have some numbers, but I can't kind of extrapolate and say, this is the whole number. But it shows continuity. It shows many more people did something, and this is only the numbers of public protests. This is not the number of other offenses, like, for example, wrong fire alarms or something. Right. Yeah? So I think the numbers are much bigger than we expected. We can say they are widespread. They might have not been kind of the rule, but they are definitely not the exception. Yeah.
Yeah, on the back.
My question is really a dual question. Is there a tradition in German law prior to the Nazi era of trial by jury? And the second question is, were these trials conducted in front of one judge or a panel of judges?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, as far as I know, there are no juries in German law. You have one judge, and then you have co-judges, which are picked from the public. So that's kind of, you have probably 3 judges, but the main judge is the decider. So that's kind of, and they included usually Nazi party member in the 1930s as kind of co-judges, but there's no jury.
Let's also look here, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering, did the United States have any influence or get any role into this? It seems the United States is always trying to help other countries and help other people, which they're doing now, but it seems to me they didn't care about what was going on in Germany. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of newspaper reports throughout the 1930s and 40s about the persecution of the Jews in Germany. There was some kind of intervention after Kristallnacht that the US kind of withdraw the ambassador because of Kristallnacht, but not as much as we hoped for, like as in interventions. But then on the other hand, it is also very difficult for the outside world to get the necessary information in these cases and to judge what is kind of what is happening on the ground really. So for example, my next book will be what I already mentioned, is about the destruction of Jewish homes during Kristallnacht, which we overlooked also. Although if you talk to survivor families, they all talk about this. But if you read history books, it is about synagogues and shops. So why I looked into newspaper reports of Kristallnacht, and also there it starts already then. They only talk about synagogues and shops because they couldn't see, for example, in the Berlin apartment building, when in the first floor the stormtroopers would raid an apartment, the diplomats or the journalists on the street would not kind of observe this. They didn't have the information. If there were photographs taken, they would be taken from destroyed shops and synagogues. So there is sometimes a disconnect between what happens actually and what people can witness and can report on.
Did the, like the Stasi, did the German authorities use informers? And how did the informers use to suppress the people within? I mean, like, you know, there'd be so many you wouldn't know who would, you know, like kind of thing.
Yeah, so there were, the Gestapo had informants, definitely, not just individuals, but also informants. They got information from, let's say, city governments and so on, so Nazi party offices. They got a lot of denunciations this way. As I mentioned, for example, the bus conductor was practically an informant when he denunciated what David Bornstein did there. Then the security service of the SS, they hired informants, so they paid people to inform them for their policies. So and then later in the war, the most notorious one is that when the mass deportation started, the Gestapo pressed Jews whom they caught in hiding to serve as informants to kind of denounce other Jews they knew who would be in hiding. So that's the most kind of egregious form of informants. But most of the things, how these cases are discovered, comes from random denunciations on the street, because just people witnessed this. And this is also the case why I don't have so much information about the destruction of anti-Jewish posters and Nazi flags, because it takes a second to rip down a poster, and if there's nobody around, you get away with it easily. Yeah? So the different forms of resistance were also in a different way risky.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, how much documentation was there in the archives of prosecution of non-Jews for supporting Jews or hiding Jews or denouncing treatment of Jews?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So, interestingly, as much as I found about Jewish resistance, I found also in the same sources non-Jewish resistance, specifically against the persecution of the Jews, which is also a totally kind of side we missed out on, because we always thought the majority of the Germans were just standing idle by, they were the fanatics, but the most people would just not care. And this is actually also not true. So we have in these sources like police logbooks, the court records, there are a lot of non-Jewish Germans who actually show solidarity, who speak up in public, who write against the persecution. So, I mean, this was really unexpected. Yeah, this is, and I think deserves another book by somebody else to really do this, because I have already my work carved out with the other book. So, but this was surprising to me too, because again, I work on this topic for so many years now and decades. The same sources reveal also kind of a large margin of non-Jewish Germans actually showing much more solidarity. And interestingly, and I want to highlight this, again, one of the kind of assumptions we had was, in general, anti-Nazi resistance would be strong in the beginning, and then it would kind of like fade, right? With the more kind of repression, the more the Nazis kind of got power, the more they indoctrinated, the less non-Jewish Germans would resist. That's also not the case. In the records I looked at, interestingly, similar to the Jewish resistance, who kind of spiked according to new laws, like the Nuremberg race laws or Kristallnacht and violent events. Accordingly, we have also spikes in non-Jewish kind of protest against the persecution, but in a different way than the Jewish resistance, which I found very interesting. So, for example, I expected there would be, after I discovered this, there would be more anti-Jewish or protests by non-Jews against the persecution, for example, around Kristallnacht. But it was not. It was actually some months before Kristallnacht. And why was this? Because my explanation is the summer 1938 was a summer which right now, when we look back, was uneventful. But at the time, people were extremely scared that the war will break out in summer 1938 against Czechoslovakia. As history unfolded, this never happened. And that's why we don't care so much. But if you look into the sources, people were on the ground saying, if we persecute the Jews, the Czechs will persecute us Germans in Czechoslovakia. So this was one motive why they would speak up against the persecution. Yeah? So that's very interesting, that there were different spikes, but it was not like a fading line, or it's much more in waves and responding to actual events and circumstances.
Yeah.
So in your work, you are gleaning motivations of these figures from the sources that you're reading, and I'm wondering, or the sources you're consulting, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the limits of interpretive license for what might have motivated Hans Oppenheimer or Benno Neuberger in particular, and where in the sources do you glean their motivations?
Yeah, this is the hardest thing, to get close to an idea why they acted in the moment they acted. And so what I try to show with the story of Hans Oppenheimer is what I glance from his life is the accumulation practically of his personal experience of repression. Just imagine, as somebody with no perspective of a future in Germany, put into a labor camp, forced labor as a 16-year-old, heavy manual labor, that's kind of something, and then the specific anti-Jewish attitudes in the labor camp. I think there is a moment where this kind of accumulates to an anger and kind of a repulsion that this drives somebody to act. And I think similar, I think this is true for the story of Benno Neuberger, who kind of tried desperately to get out of Germany with his wife to follow his kids to the United States, doesn't get out, and then is humiliated again and again. He spends time, which I didn't mention, doing Kristallnacht in a concentration camp in Dachau. So there is also this kind of accumulation of personal experience, general experience, which then at some point leads people, I think, kind of to snap. And I think often also public protest is where I see this, the moment that somebody can't just take it anymore. Yeah.
Could I ask one follow-up?
Sure.
In the letters that Benno writes to his family, does he talk about his motivations? And also, would you interpret Hans's suicide attempts as resistance?
Ooh. Okay, first question. The letters they are mostly to his children in the United States, and they end around like 1941. So we don't, and he did actually what he did in secret. Not even his wife would know about this. So he kept this from his wife. And there's a letter in his trial file, which is actually to his wife, and where he, in a way, admits that he did this, and kind of indirectly, and said, I should not have done this, and I know this is now difficult, and brought me in huge trouble. So, but he doesn't reveal the actual motivation there. Yeah, so it's really about my work as a historian to look at all the circumstances and my knowledge about what happens in Munich specifically, so to kind of connect this to the personal experience of Benno Neuberger to understand what can be the motivation of this. And sometimes it's really interesting. I have to say, from all my work what I did, sometimes we underestimate personal experience. So when he mentions in his trial that he was hating Hitler because of his announcement that he will exterminate the Jews, which he did in a public speech in January 1939, the speech is known. We sometimes refer to it, but I had no clue how big of an impact this had on an individual person, Jewish person in Germany. And I found this actually out. It is not just Benno Neuberger. There is a diary of Willy Cohn in Breslau. He mentions the same speech, that this had a big impact on him. So we should not underestimate kind of general kind of speeches of Hitler, certain laws, but also these other personal experiences like concentration camp or the loss of their children, right?
Maybe one more. We have time for one or two more, I think. Sure. Yeah.
Going back to the question about non-Jews speaking up for, resisting, did you notice or remark on how those non-Jews were punished or not punished in comparison to how the Jews were?
Yeah, interestingly, they were mostly punished with very similar sentences. Yeah, I mean, I never did I took notes about the sentences and exactly. But what I noticed among Jews is also that it depended on the specific personal circumstances, if they got 3 months, 6 months, or 10 months. And it's very similar are the sentences for non-Jewish Germans. Sometimes because what they did is they emphasized that Jews should be punished harder, but by law they couldn't. That's the interesting thing. I mean, the law allowed for 3 to 10 months. And this law was valid for Jews and non-Jews. Yeah? So the judge could not really kind of go beyond this. Still thinking about that there was a legal framework. Yeah? What they could do is then afterwards, when they sometimes put in, after the prison sentence is served, they should be handed over to the Gestapo. This is then for the later period in the war, which they usually didn't do in the early 30s. But in the war, you find these notes.
Do you have a last question?
Go ahead and take the last question. Sure.
No,
Okay.
do you,
I guess
I give you the privilege of the last question.
I'm up here and I have a microphone. So this conceptualization of resistance, and so early on you mentioned how some of the Israeli historians, I think Phil Friedman was perhaps mentioned in the book, of kind of a different conceptualization early on. And I'm just wondering, is there something about the Israeli milieu or kind of situation and why they kind of have a kind of different approach early on? Just curious about that. And then another really interesting thing that shows up in the book, and you talked about today, the idea that the survivors themselves, when they're narrating their own stories, are kind of also kind of accepting this larger kind of bracketed conception of resistance. And just, I mean, this is a very broad question, but I mean, why is that? Is it just the larger seminal events of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in their minds, or partisans that they knew? Is it a sense of guilt, or why would they kind of leave out their things that they may have done themselves that could be conceived as resistance? Just another question.
Yeah, that's. I mean, the last one is difficult because I think one is this kind of understanding of resistance, but then also that probably in a way that these small things didn't lead to anything. Yeah, they didn't. In the eyes of the survivors, they didn't change, which is actually not true, because when you look at some of these acts of resistance, they had an impact. There was, for example, Jews in Berlin were not allowed to do grocery shopping between during the day, only between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, where most of the good stuff was already gone during the war. So many Jews tried to kind of circumvent this. So they went to shops before 4 p.m. in the morning. And this was so frequent, or they asked neighbors to buy for them. So this was so frequent that the police president in Berlin had to issue 3 times new decrees to enforce this restriction. Yeah? The same is true for the Yellow Star. In a small town in Bohemia, the Gestapo went in October 1941 to the Jewish community and said, we will arrest the Jews if they don't put on the Yellow Star. This is kind of obligatory. 1 month later, the same conversation happens, and the Gestapo said, we already arrested 12 Jews. You have to make sure that every Jew takes on the Yellow Star. 3 months later, the Gestapo has the same conversation with the Jewish community. Your Jews are still not wearing the star. You need to put on the star. Yeah, so this is kind of where you see there was an effect, what they did, although it was later not recognized or not seen as important in the course of all of these events. And now I lost the first question.
On the Israeli historians, early on, like, I mean,
Yeah.
they're coming from the same experience, but is there something going on in Israel that makes them kind of conceptualize this differently? Or?
Yeah, I think in Israel there was from the very first beginning, from the very first days on in Palestine, there was a much more emphasis of resistance in general, and armed resistance in general. But then also all of these survivors had their own experiences, and most of these early historians were survivors. So that's why they emphasized, for example, spiritual resistance, because their own experience in the ghetto showed them it was not just armed resistance, there was so much more. What I found with the difference in Germany is that some of the resistance, cultural resistance, education as resistance, religion, preservation of religions as resistance, which was very important in the ghettos in Eastern Europe, was not really important in Germany, because things played out differently in Germany, because the Nazis tried to segregate the Jewish communities, and actually fostered that they had their own cultural organizations, that they kind of did their religion, that they did their own education. That's why Hans Oppenheimer went to a Jewish kind of vocational school. So there were different circumstances which led to different kind of types of resistance, forms of resistance.
Thank you so much, Wolf Gruner, for talking to us about your really important book, and let's thank you one more time.